The best UFC fighters of the 2020s. I want to look at the GOAT list from a different perspective, that being who has been the best fighters of the last decade, or the last 5 years, should I say, because it's of the 2020s. We went through the all-time GOAT list a million times now. Let's talk about who's been the best of the 2020s so far. We've officially reached halfway through the decade, so I think it's a good point to stop and say, hey, who's been the greatest fighters of these last 5 years? So with that being said, I have the top 10 in my opinion. Let's get on right into number 10, Tom Aspinall. Listen, you guys know I love a good Tom Aspinall glaze session, but since 2020, he has gathered wins over Curtis Blades, Sergey Pavlovich, Marcin Tybura, Alexander Volkov, and Andrei Arlovsky. A lot of people crap on me for bringing up the Andrei Arlovsky win, but listen, man. Tom Aspinall was one of the only guys to finish Andrei Arlovsky. Everybody else took him to a boring decision. Tom Aspinall did what you're supposed to do to Andrei Arlovsky. Beat him up and then submit him in the second round. He also is the only guy in the UFC to submit Alexander Volkov. He beat the biggest unk in the heavyweight division in Marcin Tybura, which in hindsight is aging well because Tybura is on a win streak right now. He beat Sergey Pavlovich on 2 weeks' notice when Pavlovich was on a 6-fight win streak, all first-round knockouts. And he has a win over Curtis Blades, which is a great win because Blades had a win over him, which is kind of a fluke. And yeah, since arriving in the UFC, he has gathered the interim title by defeating Curtis Blades. He has defended that title one time due to John Jones actively ducking him, and he also has the shortest average fight time in UFC history with 2 minutes and 2 seconds, which is absolutely crazy. This guy's had 10 fights in the UFC with the average fight time of 2 minutes and 2 seconds. Just for some clarification, John Jones's average fight time is in the 17-minute range. And yeah, Tom Aspinall might just be the greatest finisher in UFC history because he melts through everybody like butter. And there's a reason that John Jones is ducking this guy. I mean, I would duck him as well. So Tom Aspinall at number 10, like I said, if you look at his wins and how impressive he's been, shortest average fight time, interim champion, and he's defended his interim belt. Got to give some respect to Tom Aspinall at the number 10 spot. Coming in at the number 9 spot, Charles do Bronx Oliveira. Wins since 2020. He's defeated Michael Chandler 2 times. He actually was the first guy to defeat Michael Chandler in the UFC, which was a great win at the time. Beneil Dariush was on an 8-fight win streak when Charles Oliveira finished him. Justin Gaethje, he sent him flying across the octagon and submitted him in the first round. Submitted Dustin Poirier, nearly submitted Tony Ferguson, and just submitted Kevin Lee. So Charles Oliveira went on a generational run in between 2019 and 2022, capturing the lightweight strap in that run, and 11-fight win streak with 10 finishes. He got all the way up to pound for pound number 3, 2 title defenses against Dustin Poirier as well as Justin Gaethje, and obviously he captured the belt, eventually losing it to Islam Makhachev. But man, Charles Oliveira had one of the most exciting title runs we've ever seen in the history of the sport. This guy was marauding forward, looking for finishes. He was not looking to point fight or make it to a decision. No, he was looking to knock your head off and get you out of there. And I think since 2020, his list of names with Chandler twice, Dariush, Gaethje, Poirier, Ferguson, and Lee, it's a really good list, and he came very close to defeating Arman Tsarukyan. So close, but Arman Tsarukyan did more, ground and pounded him, and ended up winning by decision. And yeah, man, Charles Oliveira still doing the thing at 35 years old, 15 years into his UFC career. This guy is still a top 2 lightweight, so put some respect on his name. I have him at the number 9 spot. Moving on to the number 8 spot, Israel Adesanya. Now, I contemplated not putting Israel Adesanya on this list, given how many recent losses he has, but I decided to give him his flowers and put him on the list at number 8. Since 2020, he has knocked out Alex Pereira. He defeated Jared Cannonier, Robert Whittaker, Marvin Vettori, Paulo Costa, Yoel Romero. Yes, they are in the Yoel Romero and Robert Whittaker rematch. You could argue that he nearly lost those fights, but he was a UFC middleweight champion, a long-standing champion, 5 title defenses. I think he was 12-0 in the UFC at one point. Went up to challenge Jan Blachowicz for a second title, but came up short. But either way, Israel Adesanya was not only one of the greatest middleweight champions, but he was always one of the most active champions, which I think we took for granted because we have a lot of inactive champions right now. John Jones, Bilal Muhammad, even Islam to some degree. Like, these guys don't fight that often, and Israel Adesanya was one of those fighters that put his belt on the line often, and he also fought the best fighters arguably. So although you could say that his fighting style was very boring when he was champion, which I can't agree outside the Paulo Costa fight, he did defend against the boogeymen of the division in the Yoel Romeros and the Marvin Vettoris. Marvin Vettori is an absolute boogeyman at middleweight. But either way, Another accomplishment of Israel Adesanya's is that he defeated Alex Pereira, which was very impressive considering Pereira had 2 wins over him in kickboxing already, and Alex Pereira also had defeated him in mixed martial arts. So to come back and beat a guy who's beat you 3 times is impressive. So I do have Israel Adesanya on this list at the number 8 spot. Coming in at the number 7 spot, Bilal, no one remembers his name, Muhammad. Since 2020, he has defeated Leon Edwards, Gilbert Burns, Sean Brady, Stephen Thompson, and Damian Maia. Now, I will say the Leon Edwards win is probably not going to age well. The Gilbert Burns win, not the best. You know, Gilbert Burns had 1 arm that entire fight, and Bilal did dominate the fight. Sean Brady's an amazing win. Wonder Boy's a decent win, and Damian Maia, So I don't have him too high on this list, and he is on an 11-fight unbeaten streak, but Bilal Muhammad has not lost, I think, since 2019, since he lost to Jeff Neal, but he's he's the current UFC welterweight champion, 11-fight unbeaten streak. And he's gathered some pretty solid wins for himself. The only thing that goes against Bilal is that his lack of finishes, and a lot of the guys he beat were over the hill. Like Gilbert Burns, you could argue he was over the hill. Stephen Thompson, you could argue he was over the hill. Damian Maia was definitely over the hill. Leon Edwards and Sean Brady, good wins. Obviously, he beat Leon, who was champion at the time. And yeah, man, shout out to Bilal Muhammad. He did this thing. As much as I dislike his fighting style, I have to put respect on his name that he does have an 11-fight unbeaten streak, and he is dominating guys in that division. So I'm excited to see him versus JDM, and yeah, may the best man win. But I do have Bilal Muhammad at the number 7 spot. Moving on to the number 6 spot, we have Dricus du Plessis. Since 2020, Dricus du Plessis has defeated Sean Strickland 2 times. Very impressive. He dominated him in the rematch, as I predicted. Israel Adesanya, he submitted Izzy, the first guy to submit Izzy in the UFC. He finished Robert Whittaker by strikes. I think he finished Derek Brunson by strikes, and he submitted Darren Till. So Dricus du Plessis, in his 9 UFC appearances, has finished 6 of those fights. And en route to doing that, he has captured the middleweight title, gathered a 9-0 record in the UFC, and has now defended his title 2 times. And listen, if this guy goes on to defeat Khamzat Chimaev and finishes him, you got to start talking about Dricus as one of the greatest middleweights, arguably passing up Israel Adesanya. Because although he would only have 3 title defenses, you could argue that his level of competition and his dominance, it would be better than Adesanya. So Dricus, although his style isn't always the prettiest and he doesn't look the flashiest or like the most technical guy in the world, man, this guy finds a way to win and do it dominantly in most fights. So put some respect on Dricus du Plessis' name. I have him at the number 6 spot. And yeah, man, this guy's building up quite the resume for himself at middleweight. Moving on to the number 5 spot, we have Merab Dvalishvili. Since 2020, Merab, although lack of finishes or no finishes really outside of Marlon Moraes, he has gone on a generational run, taking Umar Nurmagomedov's undefeated record, defeating 4 former champions in a row in Sean O'Malley, Henry Cejudo, Piotr Jan, Jose Aldo. And before that, he had a finish over Marlon Moraes, and he beat the GOAT, John Dodson. So Merab's wins since 2020 are arguably the most impressive of any fighter on this list. The issue with Merab is that a lot of those fights were closer than people want to admit, and he stalls against the fence, and he doesn't have the most exciting fighting style, and he doesn't finish guys. Like, listen, I value finishes. You guys know that. But with that being said, I still have him in the top 5 of UFC fighters since 2020. Accolades, UFC bantamweight champion. He's now defended the title against Umar, which is a very impressive defense considering Umar was undefeated. And he's on a 12-fight win streak in the UFC. People forget, man. Merab Dvalishvili is on a 12-fight win streak, and yeah, he was the guy to take the belt from O'Malley, and they're looking to do the O'Malley rematch now. I just don't see O'Malley beating him. I do think that Merab will take the belt and keep it. And yeah, man, the only thing that's going to beat Merab in this division is Father Time, as he's 34 years old now. But his cardio is the best we've ever seen, and I have him at the number 5 spot. Coming at the number 4 spot, we're going to have none other than Alex Pereira. Alex Pereira blast onto the scene in the UFC in 2021, I believe, or 2022. But either way, in that time, he has gotten wins over Khalil Roundtree, 2 wins over Yuri Prohaska. He's actually the only fighter to defeat Yuri Prohaska in the last, 10 years? Knocked out Jamal Hill, beat Jan Blachowicz in a very close contested fight, knocked out Israel Adesanya, taking his belt, and knocked out Sean Strickland, the last guy to finish Sean Strickland. So Alex Pereira has built up one of the greatest resumes of the 2020s, and the only thing going against him to pass some of these other guys is he has some losses. You know, he just lost to Magomed Ankalaev, very close fight, and he did get KO'd by Israel Adesanya, which in hindsight wasn't the best look, considering Izzy is now 1-4 in his last 5, with his only win in his last 5 coming against Alex Pereira. But his accolades: UFC middleweight champion, UFC light heavyweight champion, and he has the fastest time to get 3 title defenses in the modern era. I think he did it in like 157 days or something crazy. If this guy would have defeated Magomed Ankalaev, that would have been 4 title defenses in the span of less than a year, which is unheard of in modern day UFC. You see a lot of guys these days just sitting on their ranking, not really wanting to defend their belt that often. They get a taste of that championship money, and it looks like all of a sudden you barely see these guys. But Alex Pereira has been the guy stepping up on short notice, saving UFC events time and time again, and performing, man. And listen, hopefully this guy can recapture his title against Ankalaev in the rematch, but it is a tall task as he's getting older. He's going to be 38 in July, and yeah, man. Let's see what Alex Pereira can do in the rest of his career. But even if this guy were to never win a fight again, or he would have never fight again, he's carved quite the resume for himself. And I have him as the 4th greatest fighter of the 2020s. Moving on to the next fighter on this list at the number 3 spot, I have Ilia Topuria. Yes, a lot of people are going to disagree and say that Alex should be above Ilia, but Alex has 2 losses. Ilia has been nothing but dominant, and his last 2 wins, back-to-back knockouts over Max Holloway and Volkanovski, are arguably the greatest 2 back-to-back knockouts in the history of the UFC. He also submitted Bryce Mitchell, who's a pretty good submission artist. He 50-42 Josh Emmett, got one of the only 10-7 rounds in UFC history. He knocked out the boogeyman of the featherweight division, if you ask Joe Rogan at least, Ryan Hall, when everybody was high on Ryan Hall. And he has a win over Yusuf Zalal, which aged well. Yusuf Zalal, since losing to Ilia, is now on a 6-fight win streak, I believe. And accolades: UFC featherweight champion, 1 title defense, and he's found his way into the pound-for-pound top 3, which is very impressive. Ilia Topuria is the first guy to finish Max Holloway. Max Holloway, before fighting Topuria, had the longest or the most amount of UFC fights without being knocked out at 28. And in his 29th appearance against Ilia Topuria, I believe Max Holloway was chinned in that fight. Something like that. Correct me if I'm wrong. But yeah, Max Holloway, or it might have been 30 or 31 fights. But either way, he's the first guy to finish Max Holloway, first guy to beat Alexander Volkanovski at featherweight. And yeah, man, I think his quality of wins are better than Alex Pereira. And you take that on top of the fact that he's been dominant and he hasn't lost, and he's pound for pound top 3. And he's looking to fight Islam or Charles Oliveira next in that lightweight division. And I'm excited to see it. But Ilia Topuria, some things to knock him on is that he's not the most active fighter in the world. And this dude's literally trying to speed run his UFC career. I mean, he got 1 title defense, dipped out of featherweights, now looking to fight Islam, probably get that belt, defend 1 time, and then retire, knowing Ilia. But I do have him as the 3rd best fighter of the 2020s for myself. Moving on to the next fighter on this list, number 2, Alexander Volkanovski. Now, a lot of people are going to say, how do you have Alexander Volkanovski above Ilia Topuria? Well, I do. I think he's been a little bit more impressive than Ilia in the 2020s. In the 2020s, he has gotten wins over Max Holloway 2 times, and the 3rd fight against Max Holloway was one of the most impressive performances I've ever seen. He dominated Max Holloway for 5 rounds, which is arguably more impressive than knocking him out. Who dominates Max Holloway for 5 rounds? Nobody does. He destroyed Max Holloway in that trilogy. He had a very close win over him in the 2nd fight, destroyed Korean Zombie, destroyed Brian Ortega, and destroyed Yair Rodriguez. UFC featherweight champion, 5 title defenses, and he claimed pound for pound number 1, which Ilia Topuria couldn't do yet, at least. 11-fight win streak before losing to Islam Makhachev, and he arguably beat Islam Makhachev in that first fight. I know a lot of people say Islam edged it out, but man, was that a close fight. And it was so close that the UFC pound-for-pound rankings kept Alexander Volkanovski at the number 1 spot after he lost to Makhachev. That's how close the fight was. So put some respect on Volk's name. One of the most active featherweight champions, the greatest featherweight of all time. And if you were to include the 2019s, you could also include the Aldo, Mendez, and Max Holloway 1 win. But nonetheless, I still have Alexander Volkanovski as the 2nd greatest fighter of the 2020s. You could argue for Alex Pereira and Ilia to be above him, maybe, but I just think the wins over Max Holloway and how dominant he was and how close he had a fight with Islam Makhachev. Featherweight champion, 11-fight win streak, pound for pound number 1, 5 title defenses. I do think you have to have Volkanovski at that number 2 spot. And coming in at the 1st spot, no surprise, it's going to be Islam Makhachev. It's not even close. Islam, by far, has been the best UFC fighter of the 2020s and the most impressive. This guy, since 2020, has defeated Renato Moicano, Dustin Poirier, Alexander Volkanovski twice, knocking him out in the rematch, granted on short notice, submitting the submission king in Charles Oliveira, destroying the GOAT Bobby Green, submitting Dan Hooker, submitting Drew Dober. All this since 2020. Accolades: UFC lightweight champion, most title defenses in the division's history at 4, pound for pound number 1 fighter in the world. He also has 2 wins over top 3 pound for pound fighters in Charles Oliveira and Alexander Volkanovski. I think he's the first fighter in UFC history to claim or stop 2 win streaks that were above 10. He stopped Oliveira's win streak, which is at 11, and he stopped Volkanovski's win streak, which is also at 11. He also has the second longest win streak in UFC history at 15. Like I said, pound for pound #1, finishing everybody. Islam Makhachev has finished 8 of his last 9 opponents, which is extremely impressive in my opinion. So, I mean, if you don't have Islam at the #1 spot, who else could you argue? This guy has done it all. He's been extremely impressive. Unfortunately, due to circumstances outside of his control, he has had to take on a fight against Alexander Volkanovski, the second fight, and Renato Moicano on short notice, which has kind of tainted his legacy because people say, oh, he's beating guys on short notice, he's beating featherweights. But listen, man, he's finishing these guys. He's doing what he's supposed to do. He's active for the most part. He has been a little inactive in times in his career, but he's been defending his belt twice a year, fighting twice a year consistently, and putting on amazing performances. So for me, Islam Makhachev by far is the best fighter of the 2020s. This is my top 10 fighters of the 2020s, guys. Call them GOATs, call them the best, whatever you want to call them. I think that Islam tops the charts. Let me know in the comments what you think of my list. What would you change overall? And yeah, agree or disagree. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Drop a like on the video if you enjoyed. I'm out, guys. Peace.